Hey guys, so I'm going into the next video in this series of discussing what are the kind of possible AI systems that we could conceive from a particular possibility space. So in the previous video I discussed a number of topics on how you can think about where ideas could come from, like a family of ideas of, say, there's a spectrum between, say, a more decentralized or more centralized AI ecosystem. And I was coming up with some of the core ideas is that there is like a pure possibility space that one can imagine that's completely disorganized, and there's some like cool philosophy of language, like thought experiments that you can think about when like picking out these ideas, which I discussed previously. So that's things like the Library of Babel. So in this video, I decided that one of the ways you can think about designing systems is at least coming with, even if it's your own subjective viewpoint here, is to sort of figuring out like a framework for seeing other people's perspectives, which I did touch on in the previous video. And I guess when it comes to artificial intelligence, this industry that's really just taken many people's lives by storm, and I guess the world by storm for a variety of perspectives, and everyone can have completely diverging opinions, which I find pretty fascinating. It's the first time in a while that a technology has been this divisive from different perspectives, which is part of why I'm doing this. So the first thing in terms of like a framework when it comes to artificial intelligence and these different perspectives. This is just mine. It's very incomplete, but it's one way I've thought about it. Is I've divided it up between three overall perspectives. You can be optimistic, neutral, skeptical, or like negative with regards to AI. And then you can also take a second dimension, which is the perspective from more of a less technical, maybe like the humanities, non-deterministic, and creative, in terms of like how AI impacts different fields. That's one way you could think about it, or more like aiming on the side of like socioeconomic issues. Then there's also the perspective of just like technology, so like STEM. This is obviously more deterministic. This is more like interest in software and software engineers, and it's obviously more technical. Now, I'd put a caveat here: is I'm not particularly technical, but I do have enough general knowledge and self-taught knowledge to have sort of like somewhat of a broad framing of different viewpoints that I've just learned. And I'll link some really good starting points for technical talks on this topic. This is the perspective now, like getting a handle on the industry as a whole, from different perspectives, both optimistic, negative, and then a sort of a third position, maybe like neutral and skeptical, which I guess is probably one of the more common positions at the moment. Which kind of makes sense, just given all the different incentives in the industry. So yeah, the big framing point I have here is that this is my perspective. The question would be is like there's an infinite amount of ways you could frame this, and this is just one particular one. So I don't think this is like the be all and end all, but it's at least a little bit more, I think, sophisticated than just sort of pro AI, anti AI. That starts to make more sense the more granular in detail you can get here. So um, I guess on the optimistic front, you can think of, I guess most people are very optimistic by this idea that technology can accelerate and improve things in a number of ways. So on the technical front, you could think that, like, if we just take the one way you want to think about designing systems is, if you're optimistic from a technology perspective with AI, you could consider the possibility that even if AI goes fantastic, there are ways it can definitely go wrong. And one of the ways that can go wrong is that there's multiple single points of failure in the system. And what I mean by that is, I talked about last time how you can think about AI as this complex system where you're not too sure exactly what's going to emerge from it, in the medium and long term. In the short term, and right now we've seen what AI and commercial AI and chatbots and personal AI agents and coding agents, we can see what they're producing, of course. But we're talking now, like in the medium and long term, what are the actual consequences of that? And you don't need to do a complex analysis to figure out that if you've got a complex system that itself is disrupting other complex systems, such as different industries, such as cybersecurity, biotech, different technologies in general, it's obvious that there's different fragilities that are going to emerge from that and can cause catastrophic failures in one way, shape, or form. If you take the example of the financial crisis of 2008, there was every incentive in the world for economists and banks and all manners of financial market participants to bet that the financial crisis was going to happen. And some people did do that, but they were in the vast minority that benefited from that trade. And that's an interesting case because it's an example of that a failure in a complex system that's very difficult to predict, but is obvious in hindsight. And Nassim Taleb refers to those as black swans. You know, it's the topic of his book Black Swan that he released after the financial crisis of 2008. So that a similar thing is probably happening in AI, and I feel even if you're as optimistic as you are, if you're one of these sort of AI accelerationists in the most optimistic sense, you do have to admit that there is something about complex systems crashing to other complex systems that can cause major risks that are hidden in all these different ways because of different incentives. So I think a solution you want to start thinking about is how would you incentivize the decentralization of AI, both through like how open source models are diffused and distributed into the world. So that's one way. How the models are trained. So there's obviously some labs that are focused on that, as opposed to just have these monoliths that are releasing these frontier models that can cause disruptions, such as like the cybersecurity angle, for example, is the recent case. So that's a case where even if you as optimistic as you are, there are definitely improvements you could imagine for the AI industry, and that's sort of what I'm getting at. So I've spent enough time on the optimistic angle. I feel like they need that perspective the most because they're a little bit self-referential, or they sort of go in this circular loop of reasoning where they're saying like, look, AI is so great that it's going to solve all the problems, including the problems that AI is going to create. And the problem with that is that there's definitely catastrophic risks that can emerge that AI can't solve in time. I mean, if you want to go along with that sort of like hand waving and like over optimistic, naively optimistic worldview, it just seems too incomplete or just too weak of a position to take, to be honest. Like, I don't know if people ironically believe this or they just sort of do this for engagement baiting on social media, but I feel like they're unironically believing this, like a naively optimistic view. It just seems incomplete and too weak. So there's definitely improvements to a AI ecosystem you can imagine, even if you use the most optimistic perspective you can imagine. So one of the ways I'm thinking about is, maybe there's some ways which peer-to-peer network designs for agentic AIs and persons in that system can work in a number of interesting ways. What that exactly looks like, again, we're picking ideas out from like a possibility space, and I don't want to prescribe any particular one just yet until it gets more robust. But one of the ways I think about it is make them more bottom up and allow for network design that can fail quickly, sort of like in like a sort of lean startup fashion, like a lean network, fail when the stakes are low, so that you can take the learnings in an evolutionary way and sort of take the learnings from a previously failed network and quickly fork that into something more useful, learn from mistakes, make it more robust, ideally make it anti-fragile, as Nassim Taleb talks about. Anyway, so that's enough on the optimistic side, but I feel I had to spend the most time on that one because they seem to be the loudest perspective. And I am personally quite optimistic about like what AI can do and help with doing, not necessarily it solves things by itself. The biggest problem with the optimism perspective is that there's so many incentives to over hype AI and over prescribe the use of AI in different fields, and also over attribute AI when it solves something. Like, let's say there's like a major breakthrough in biotech, it'll be difficult to separate to what extent AI actually helped with it. because there'll just be so much noise around it. Like even if a biotech lab partially uses AI to like help automate some trivial task in the bigger task of saying making a biotech breakthrough, just to oversimplified, it'll be spun as that like, AI is helping these massive breakthroughs. You kind of get the idea, right? So it's going to be very difficult to separate to what extent is AI actually helping making breakthroughs. But I do believe, in an absolute sense, of course, it will help. We just don't know to what extent just yet, and there's just too many incentives to make all these kind of distortions. Anyway, so that's the optimistic perspective on the technical front. On the humanities and the creative front, even if you're very optimistic about this idea that AI can create a lot of progress for general non-technical roles, creative roles, it can help people now have like their own video studios, as it were, or just create their own art. There's obviously a lot of problems around that, which I guess my next cells in this table will address, which is obviously the problem of attribution. To what extent that you want to live in this world where you're effectively going to make artists and creative persons economically extinct. I was just listening to a great talk by Casey and Demetri, which I'll link. They've been doing talks on the AI industry, and their discussion recently was on this point: is that there is a case where even if artificial intelligence can do creative tasks better, quote unquote, than humans, you still want to be making a system that still makes space for people that want to be full-time artists or full-time do full-time creative work. Of course, full-time software engineers. Even the most optimistic scenario where you can imagine AI like gives everyone a high standard of living or something, there's something to be said that you want people to be able to participate in this thing more democratically, and that's sort of the main point I make here on the non-technical front. So that's just something to think about. Like, what are the kind of policies people would vote for if they actually had a real vote, not like sort of a ostensible vote in the current political systems that we find ourselves in. So I just sort of put some ideas out there. That's something to think about with system design. But yeah, let's move to the more neutral, skeptical topics. If you're going to make a lot of optimistic claims, it's good to think about what, like, even if you can't perceive why someone would be skeptical about AI. That's like really important. Like, if you can't put yourself in the shoes of someone who's skeptical and sort of just ad hominem them and say like, oh, they can't see the future, or you're going to question their intelligence. There is definitely a gap in your thinking, and these are the kind of things you want to think about with system design also, and vice versa. If someone's very skeptical, I think it's good to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of someone who's both optimistic and highly pessimistic or negative toward AI, and why they might be so, right? So I think the main thing on the creative front and the non-technical front, and just for the humanities in general, I think the main thing I've speaking to a lot of academics, there's a big concern around like attribution of work, especially with regards to like academic articles that are produced by large language models. It just seems completely incomplete to say that you can just attribute all this work to this large language model. No, there's definitely a way in which they've been trained on a lot of content in the open internet. And we need to think about, how do you actually create systems where you can reverse attribute to work that a large language model has produced. And I'm sure that would make people a lot more open toward using large language models in a variety of like non-technical contexts, like various academic article writing, fiction writing, creative or non-fiction writing, because I mean that's really fantastic. You could get a quick outline of a great academic article or a piece of non-fiction or even piece of fiction, and get the source of inspiration of those ideas. In a sense, breaking down the ideas into the smallest constituents and figuring out where those ideas came from. I think that's something that would be really great for the neutral, skeptical camp, which I find myself in. I definitely find myself in this particular cell. It just seems that's where the most asymmetry is Again, Casey and Demetri are talking about this. It's like, if you knew upfront the rules of the next 10, 15 years of what would happen to your content, let's say in 2010, would artists and um, uh, creatives and writers and coders publish their works in the ways they did with the licensing they did back then? And I think the answer is basically no. And the question then becomes, okay, well, how do you reverse that asymmetry? Because obviously the Frontier Labs leveraged this asymmetry to their favor, and it's not quite clear that they can reverse this just with money. Because if they end up making a lot of money off all these works, again, they got the upside from winning that like coin toss, as it were, or that gamble. It paid off, and now they can sort of pay off people with money. I feel like that's incomplete. I feel like a lot of people feel that's incomplete, and that's definitely something to think about in this camp of, if you're skeptical, like what do you do about that for the creatives and the humanities in general, especially if it's been published on the internet and has been part of these large language models training data. Then the second point here is just to generally just figure out where large language models are actually effective, and not to try to overprescribe their use. That's sort of the second point I put there, because I think a lot of the layoffs that people have seen in the market, I personally believe this, and I think a lot of people believe this too, is that a lot of that is driven by different economic reasons, potentially overhiring in different periods in the last like 5-6 years. And it's convenient to use the AI excuse because it's easier to make layoffs saying that, oh, we're going to get more technically efficient with these tools, and this technology that's being released, when in reality they're reversing a bad decision or overhiring decision. And that's obviously not great for the financial markets. So you want to sort of spin, there's a lot of incentives to sort of spin these things and again, overprescribe the impact, or over attribute the impact of large language models, where it really is just being used as an excuse for the financial markets. So that's on the non-technical front. On the neutral side, I definitely think this is the biggest camp for most software engineers. They feel that they're highly skeptical of AI and the AI hype, especially as it relates to the software development industry. I mean, I'm not a software engineer, but I think I've listened to enough um, uh, thinkers in all different camps in this front, and it definitely does feel like that. Even though AI can certainly help people become more technical as a learning tool, it's fantastic for that, and I've certainly used it in my capacity. There's definitely ways we can improve this and not overhype these tools to think that they're going to replace complex engineering tasks, especially now in their current form as these probabilistic systems, right? That just seems highly dangerous. And even if they could, you still want those engineers being part of the economy, and even if they're quote unquote lower skill, for a variety of reasons, the same ways that you'd want, human artists that create things. It's because you can't rule out the possibility that human beings can come up with unique ideas better than AI systems. And even if it could be the case in the future that AI systems could do that, they're not doing that today. That is clearly the case. And in my previous video, I sort of outlined, what is this interesting idea about humans that make it such that we can come to different kinds of solutions in a vast probability space faster than randomness. But on the flip side, there's obviously good sides to randomness, and that's sort of where I think people have found AI and large language models and chatbots and coding agents irresistible, is because it does pose this interesting random reward factor that we all are familiar with in one way, shape, or form. So, the question is, how do we help build in more deterministic systems to the AI ecosystem as a whole? Maybe it comes in the form of sort of like networked AI and like helping to build a more fail-safe that way from a deterministic perspective. Building more software gateways than just trusting large language model output, that kind of thing. Again, sort of talking in broad terms, because I don't have enough experience in there, but there's been a lot of great talks on that, and I'll definitely link them over time. Okay, finally in the negative camp, certainly starting with the most obvious, One is that AI has obviously caused a massive outrage toward like creatives and artists because of this deep asymmetry between the way uh, large language model labs leveraged the open internet without everyone not being aware of the rules of that game before they even existed, right? So if you could go back in time, I don't think they would have all the training data available cheap as it was if everyone knew what they were getting themselves into. And I guess you could make the argument, well, the internet benefited artists in all these different ways, and that could be true, but um, it just still seems like a big asymmetry that needs to be resolved. I just feel like the industry as a whole, especially on social media, has this like incentive to, um, I don't know why, but like antagonize creatives, which is very strange. And like, look, a lot of these creatives and a lot of these artists really wouldn't like me if they got to know me. Um, I'm very neutral when it comes to like politics and philosophy in general, and I can understand like people coming from the liberal arts and um, maybe potentially different political leanings. They would really not like me, but I can still empathize with an asymmetry when I see it. And I think this is an important one because it applies to like all industries, not just creators and artists. So I think a big risk we see, and this is where the negative non-technical camp or the negative humanities and creative camp, basically, let's call it the socioeconomic camp, and they have a negative perspective to AI. I think their overall view is that this is, the asymmetries that the AI industry is causing is going to cause an existential risk in some way, right? So this is like a completely non-technical angle where, if these asymmetries aren't addressed in the current economy and socioeconomic environment, and AI does continue to advance in the way it has, and the AI industry continues to sort of operate leveraging these asymmetries, and sort of just growing the leverage they have and only resolving them in the way that's convenient to them when they gain the resources to do so, to continue having a monopolistic advantage, then obviously there's a lot of problems here. So we need to have like a lot of mitigations and solutions around these kind of things, but also around things like AI psychosis. I feel like this is one that just gets swept under the rug by the AI industry and sort of like AI influencers in general, and sort of AI influencers is the wrong term. It's really like people are overhyping AI, and there's a lot of people that sort of sweep these things under the rug because they have the incentives to do so. I think it's very disturbing when you actually really look at what's behind AI psychosis and addiction. And of course, the problem of attribution and plagiarism. I think that is a thing that needs to be talked about in terms of fair use of these of the content, both code and writing that these tools produce. And how do you sort of resolve that? Is there a way that you can reverse compensate people? Again, it's an open question, but at least that gets a starting point to start resolving things from the negative perspective. But obviously we can also be sympathetic to say, like, look, at the end of the day, these things could unlock a lot of economic value. It's a big question of how is that distributed, and it's an open question. I'm not a fan of centralized solutions to this to resolve these asymmetries, which is why I'm thinking of what would like these decentralized networks look like, where people can, in a sense, join or experiment with these experimental networks, where they could one day grow into being like sort of a pretty powerful economic network, where upfront everyone agrees how the value can get distributed, especially if there's these asymmetries between what this technology is producing and the people that it leveraged to produce it. In other words, again, it's like an attribution thing. It's also a question of, if someone gets actually put out of a job because of technology, you want to start thinking about, okay, how do we actually build a fair system here, or a less asymmetrical system? And this is sort of going to sort of like a John Rawls sort of approach, like if you were behind the veil of ignorance, like what kind of system you'd want to pick. And you would want to pick a system where the worst off gets taken care of first, even if that's, again, not popular from certain political positions. But in this case, it's like an existential thing. And also, it's it's a creative output thing. Again, if technology can genuinely uplift almost everyone into a higher standard of living, that's better for everyone because, of course, it gets rid of the existential risk of socioeconomic collapse, but also unlocks a lot of creative potential from all these individuals. But the big question is, how do you do that without mass fraud and all the problems that comes with redistribution? And these are complex things, right? I don't think you can sort of hand wave these problems with just UBI alone, which is why I'm trying to think of a more complex approach to picking out solutions from this like possibility space, right? Again, this is just my perspective. There's different ways you can frame this to even begin thinking about picking out solutions. I'm just trying to give examples to hopefully like start some interesting conversations. Okay, lastly, so you have the technical negative one, which is probably the oldest of all these because science fiction for centuries. I don't know what the first science fiction book really detailed like an artificial intelligence, but I'm sure it's very old. And I can think of old ones that are more than 100 years old that sort of really stuck with me. And yeah, this technical perspective where AI can go very wrong, and we should not underestimate that. This is obviously a very old one. It's very old in terms of several decades worth on like less wrong forums and rationalists. And even though that's like an unpopular thing nowadays, it seems on social media, I'm not sure. It's obviously there's a lot of friction between the optimists and the pessimists. This is obviously where the discussions I feel are like the least valuable from an outside perspective. It just seems like a lot of ad hominem both ways. But to be fair, I feel like the negative camp, call it anti-AI, call it those calling for a pause in AI, whatever it is. There's obviously, I feel, a lot more asymmetry stacked against them because they don't stand to massively economic gain from their positions, and in a sense they stuck with the potential downside, except in the case where I guess if they're raising like a lot of money and maybe using it as a grift. So that is a possibility, and I'm sure that's what a lot of the accelerationists would criticize, and I think that is a fair criticism, but it's really just one particular weak point in the I guess the pro pause, pro stop camp. As a I'll just call them the negative perspective for now. But unfortunately, and this is coming from someone who's very sympathetic toward their position, I just don't think from a game theory perspective they're going to stop or pause AI. I mean, I just don't see how it happens. It just seems like there's just too much momentum. Again, this is my personal perspective. So one of the sort of solutions might be quite well, they might be attractive from a pro-pause position would be, well, could you create environments that are much more low stake that allow individuals to build weaker AI systems that are less centralized, but that could end up creating a lot of utility such that people don't feel the need to push for the most strongest frontier models. Again, this is not enough. Of course, there'll still be a push for the strongest frontier always. That's just how the game theory is going. But if you could get to the point where you had these like interesting bottom-up systems and bottom-up networks that could act as having multiple fail-safes at various different levels. Again, in this evolutionary game theoretic approach, what that means is you build AI networks and AI systems and an AI ecosystem in a evolutionary dynamic where, at least on the individual and the global population front, failures are very low stakes. So in other words, these little networks, they'll get like cyber attacked. They'll be shown to get like poisoned with bad data and like all kinds of bad actors. And slowly or surely, you'd eventually emerge a better and better system as all these different like experiments learn from each other, right? That's sort of the kind of system I'm thinking of. If you wanted to sort of build a less centralized alternative to the current AI industry. And what's cool about that is if these networks end up working and they, as I mentioned, they do become create enough utility that they're actually end up being these powerful, less centralized economic networks, like really like a decentralized technology ecosystem. The cool thing about that is you can build in a lot more protocols that everyone who's using these things, like let's say, it's in a sense, it's just another overlay to the internet, but with like a variety of different incentives put in place for all the participants, such that if like artificial super intelligence was to accidentally emerge in such a system, at least it would be subject to many more safety measures in such a system. And as I mentioned, the socioeconomic angle, it'd be subject to upfront agreements and upfront protocols for how the value and the development of such a system would emerge, right? So again, it's certainly not perfect. It's very hand wavy. It's in a sense, it's very silly and foolish, but it's something, right? And I'm sure this has been discussed in different topics, and I'll actually dive into the different literature. I'm sure it's been the topic of many discussions and possibilities over the years in different forums and in social media and probably academic articles. But this is just my perspective, and I'm putting it out there just to give some way of framing things a little bit better in case someone hasn't thought about it yet. And it's just something I'm thinking about when thinking about like proposing sort of these bottom-up alternatives to the current AI industry. Cool. That's everything for today, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Next time, I'll focus more on some specific ingredients I'm thinking about with regards to personal AI agents, including virtue ethics and Zettelkasten systems for designing better bottom-up AI, starting on the individual level. Cool. That's a little preview for next time. Cheers.